Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Today's roundtable on transportation for a green and connected Canada with Green Party of Canada leader Annamie Paul and special guests, Green Party critic for transportation and municipal affairs Tim Grant, Carole Chan, deputy critic on transportation and municipal affairs, and Terence Johnson, president of Transport Action Canada, will now begin. La table ronde d'aujourd'hui sur les transports pour un Canada vert et connecté, avec Annamie Paul, chef du Parti vert du Canada, et les invités spéciaux, Tim Grant, porte-parole du Parti vert en matière de transport et d'affaires municipales, Carole Chan, porte-parole adjointe en matière de transport et d'affaires municipales, et Terence Johnson, président de Transport Action Canada, va maintenant commencer. Merci.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you very much for being with us today. This is the third installment in our series of roundtables hosted or co-hosted and with the participation of our new Shadow Cabinet critics. It is a real pleasure and honor for me to introduce them and to have had the opportunity to introduce them. We've had a roundtable on health with our new health critic on decriminalization. We had a roundtable as well on the climate and the state of play on the climate with our climate critics. And today we are joined by our brand new critics on municipal affairs, Tim Grant and Carole Chan. And it's just wonderful to have you here and to be able to talk about transportation today. I'm here on the traditional territories of the Mississauga, of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. And so we are, as always, joined by at least one expert in the area. We always try to use our platform and share our platform with those who have a great deal to share with us about a particular policy issue that we care a great deal about. And in the case of transportation, this is, of course, at the heart of much of what we think about when we think about a green economy, when we think about a green recovery. We know that we are in a race against time to transform the way that we transport ourselves, whether that's because it's an integral part of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and bending the curve on our warming planet. Rising temperatures rather in a warming planet, whether it's because we understand that public transportation is part of good and sound planning, that it is at the heart of communities, whether it's because we understand that good transportation is also a matter of social justice. All of these reasons are reasons that the Green Party has always spent a lot of time talking about transportation and innovating on transportation and proposing innovative policy solutions, usually with the help of people like Terence Johnson, who, of course, help to help to feed our policies with their work. And so without further ado, I'm going to say the same thing in French and then pass it on to our panelists because really they're the focus of our conversation today. Alors, la transportation est quelque chose qui est toujours un grand enjeu pour le Parti vert. On sait qu'une transformation dans nos modes de transportation est au centre d'une relance verte, précisément parce que nous avons besoin d'une manière urgente d'abaisser nos taux d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Et pour le faire, il faut transformer nos modes de transportation. On sait aussi qu'il y a des questions de justice sociale liées aux transportations, surtout pour les gens de faible revenu, pour les jeunes, aussi pour les communautés rurales. On sait aussi que si on veut créer des communautés liées, si on veut assurer qu'un pays comme le nôtre est un pays lié, on doit avoir une manière de nous transporter qui n'est pas basée sur les voitures. Alors, aujourd'hui, nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir les nouveaux membres de notre cabinet fantôme responsable pour les affaires municipaux, et y compris aussi la transportation, parce que c'est un grand enjeu pour les municipalités, et aussi Terence Johnson de Transport Action, qui vont guider, je vais essayer de guider la conversation, la discussion entre eux, de l'état actuel et où nous voulons aller aussi. And so with that, I'm going to just start off. First, I'm going to ask you all to just kindly introduce yourselves, give a little bit of background about yourself, and then we're going to jump into some questions. Carole, can I start with you, please?
Thank you so much, Annamie. I'll be brief as I am the deputy critic and fairly new to this file. My name is Carole Chan, and I am currently deputy critic of transportation and municipal affairs. My interest in this actually began on the municipal side, more of a lifestyle thing on the transportation side. I didn't own my first car until we were about to have my first child, and we could only bring it home from the hospital in a car seat. So, plus Moncton winters don't lend themselves well to strollers and bicycle trailers. So, I'm really pleased to be working on this file with someone of the stature of Tim Grant and his experience, which you'll hear about shortly, in particular because I think a lot of the discussion around transportation and municipalities tends to center on larger cities and larger urban corridors. And it's just as important, if we're going to make this happen through the whole of Canada, that we not only consider rural jurisdictions, but also the more suburban and smaller cities, because we don't have the density that can justify sometimes the nice bus routes and systems that are more prevalent in the bigger cities. And yet we need to go through that mind shift, and perhaps through other forms of communal transport to make it happen. Once a week bus service to other municipal centers just doesn't cut it. So really pleased to be working on this file with Tim.
Wonderful. And of course, if you want to make any remarks in French as well, feel free. We try whenever possible to have bilingual events if we have speakers who can speak in both languages. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Annamie, and thanks, Carole, for your kind words. Malheureusement pour moi, mon français reste mauvais, alors c'est nécessaire de parler en anglais, excusez-moi. Yeah, I've had really a lifelong interest in transportation. I live in the center of downtown Toronto. I've been the provincial transport critic for the Green Party of Ontario for many years. And really, Ontario is both, has the high density areas, but also areas much like those that Carole was referring to that we need to keep in mind of. Northeastern Ontario, where we lost a provincial train a few years ago, is just as low density as many other parts of rural Canada. And so indeed, we need transportation solutions that are going to work for all areas. And indeed, they exist. And it's been a great pleasure to consult over the years with a great many people, including Transport Action Canada folks and municipal transit experts as well, to kind of come to grips with what are the real innovative solutions that can work with a thinly stretched population right across the country.
Wonderful. And then, Terence, over to you. And maybe after you introduce yourself, I'll ask you just to get us started. We have been preoccupied, and our caucus had raised the alarm about some of the impacts of the pandemic on transportation and on our ability, as Tim and Carole said, to remain connected, and particularly its impact on rural and remote communities. Can you perhaps, after you introduce yourself, just expand on that a little bit and talk about what we've seen in terms of transport across the country over the past year and a half or so?
Sure. Thank you, Annamie. Very pleased to join you this morning. My name's Terry Johnson, and as some people might be able to tell from the accent, I'm not originally from Canada. I came here in 2003 from the United Kingdom. And to a certain extent, I grew up with the propaganda that Canada was this country that had been connected by a brilliant rail network and had a wonderful transportation system. And sadly, that legacy has been really quite severely undermined. And one of the things I realize here is that even where I am in Chatham, Ontario, which is a relatively small town, we're quite privileged to have 4 trains a day. That's quite unusually high level of service for Canada. In Europe, you might see that if you're a town of 200 people, not a town of 40,000. So as I got more involved in running my business and starting my family here, I found increasingly how difficult it was to deal with the lack of mobility I was experiencing, but also because as I became involved in a lot of community causes, whether around housing or employment and healthcare access. I realized that transportation is the puzzle piece that actually connects all of these things. There's a lot of things going on that are excluding people from society in Canada, that are not allowing our governments to effectively deliver the education, the healthcare, the opportunities that Canadians have a right to expect, that at the end of the day come down to the need to get somewhere or to be able to get something to people, and we're just not doing it very well. And so I first got involved in transport action in about 2011, shortly after the Harper cuts hit southwestern Ontario. And one of the first meetings we organized was an older lady came to a meeting in Sarnia and said, look, I just want to be able to get to visit my sister in Windsor. And that kind of thing stays with me. It's the personal stories, it's the actual personal impact on people's lives that motivates me a lot more than the kind of big picture, what does this do for our GDP aspects of the transportation system. So Transport Action Canada, it's a national charity that engages in nonpartisan research, education, and advocacy for sustainable, inclusive transportation. And we were founded as Transport 2000 Canada in Regina in 1976. And as the voice of the passenger, and for those who are currently excluded from being passengers, whether it's by inadequate services, the absence of accessibility, or through poor affordability. And yes, we speak up for making sure we get dependable and affordable service to all Canadians. And whether that's in our largest cities or smallish rural communities, the Atlantic to the Pacific to the Arctic. And over the last year, we've really seen, last year and a half, how important public transport is, how it is an essential service, how it gets our essential workers to work, whether they be nurses, doctors, or just people keeping a grocery store shelves full, and how at the same time we've seen a huge challenge. Greyhound had already been backing out of Canada since about, well, actually over the years, but they backed out of Western Canada in 2018, and then they shut down all the services in Central Canada at the beginning of the pandemic. This year said, okay, we're done. We're not coming back. And we've seen a lot of Canadian companies step up, actually. And actually, Maritime Bus has been doing this in the Atlantic region for nearly a decade now, stepping into the gap that was left by larger international companies pulling out. But we have an extremely fragmented travel system. You could theoretically go from Corner Brook to Hay River, Alberta by bus. If you could figure out all the connections all for yourself, if you could walk between terminals that are not connected, if you didn't need a wheelchair, if you're young and able-bodied and could spend a lot of time figuring this out, you could probably just about do it. But that's not good enough. We actually do need something that works for all Canadians, and reintegrating this network and using the best modes of transportation that are most efficient is something we've been really talking to the government about over the last year, saying, look, you need to be the ringmaster in the circus and make sure that where bus companies coming into the same city, that there's a reasonable chance that somebody who's coming in on bus A can leave on bus B and not be stranded and on the hook for a hotel room if one of those vehicles is late. So that's one of the issues that we're dealing with and grappling with. And the timing of this event is quite interesting, because tomorrow is actually going to be the 40th anniversary of the rather fateful order in council by Jean-Luc Pépin, who was then the transport minister, that set in motion the first round of drastic cuts to Via Rail in 1981. And that also established the precedent that the federal cabinet can do whatever it likes to Via Rail without adequate parliamentary scrutiny, cutting off entire cities, entire regions of the country from the network, despite what cities, provinces, people, communities might say. And we can only dream on how much more an integrated and unified Canada we might have today if instead that government had listened to the Parliament's Rail Transport Committee back in the early 80s, which was saying they should have invested in modern and fast passenger rail between Calgary and Edmonton. Mm-hmm. So we have 40 years of misguided actions to begin to turn around. And so today I think we can talk about how we might start doing that.
That's right. We're going to get to that. Absolutely. It's always about ultimately the solutions and the proposals for positive action. Tim, coming to the climate for a second, there's a renewed focus on the climate and a renewed push globally for action, decisive action. Transportation is absolutely at the heart of that, as I said. Can we talk about that for a little bit? I mean, in terms of Canada in particular, in terms of the makeup of where our greenhouse gas emissions come from, and the ambitious target that we have as a party to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions by 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. Where are we now in terms of that, and where do we need to get to? I mean, how important is transportation to helping us reach that ambitious target?
Well, transportation is absolutely central to meeting that target, and I think we need smart investments, but we also need federal leadership. And I think Terry's just given us a quick overview of basically what's happened on the unfortunate decisions made by cabinet that have unraveled Via Rail. But to go back, I think looking at what most experts are pointing out is that the electrification of buses is probably one of the fastest and easiest ways to really revamp our transportation network. Those are coming faster. We have Canadian manufacturers here that can produce them, and that provides us with the opportunity to really develop a bus rail grid. And what we've been advocating for years, I know Transport Action Canada has too, is that we need federal leadership. I'll be perhaps a bit stronger than Transport Action in saying that we need federal leadership to say the following. Number one, bus companies. We're going to create RFPs, working with the provincial governments, create RFPs that create bus transit between towns on an hourly basis, so people can get back home, go to a doctor's appointment in the next town, and get back in the same day. And that's crucial for rural families and small town families to not have a second car. The second mandate of bus companies has to be to deliver part of the RFPs that need to be developed in the federal leadership, sort of putting an imprint on all this, is that one of the mandates of bus companies has to be to bring passengers to rail stations. And once that begins to happen, and you build up the more and more Canadians taking buses between towns, taking rail between cities, then it allows Via Rail to begin to increase its service, increase its frequency, and thereby provide better service and better options that allows more and more passengers to take rail, and more passengers can rely on buses in between. So to meet our climate objectives, the electrification, first and foremost, of buses, and a mandate for their employment between towns and bringing passengers to rail is going to really help us meet our climate objectives.
Mm-hmm. And just maybe picking up again on a point that you made, and then also, Carole, that you had touched upon regarding rural and remote communities. There are, of course, when we talk about climate justice and climate action, and the recognition that often goes hand in hand with social justice and action on social issues as well. And transportation is one of these areas where you see that, and it seems it's clear to people perhaps what the climate impacts are, but when we think about the social justice impacts as well, related to the need for affordable, accessible transportation, it can be overlooked. And so in terms of rural and remote communities in particular, we know that one of the calls for justice in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report was related to accessible rural transportation as an alternative to dangerous activities like having to hitchhike, walk down the road. That's one example. But Carole, maybe if you could expand a little bit on what it would mean to rural and remote communities to have the kind of transportation grid that Tim and Terry were talking about. I mean, economically, socially, what kind of difference would it make?
Je vais répondre en français à cette question parce que on va faire ça. Et alors, la question c'est quelle sorte d'impact ces changements vont avoir sur les communautés plutôt rurales ou les municipalités moins grandes que les grands centres du Canada. Je pense qu'il y a deux volets à ces questions. Le premier, c'est que certainement dans les communautés rurales, on a un besoin que tout le monde est là. Mais faire le choix de prendre l'autobus, ça doit être quelque chose qui fait de bon sens au niveau économique, et c'est pas juste au niveau fiscal, mais au niveau de temps personnel des gens. Ils peuvent pas attendre pour des heures pour avoir le service unique de la journée. Et pour avoir des services plus robustes, ça va vraiment changer les options pour les gens, je pense. Et surtout au niveau d'accès aux services bilingues. Je réfléchis à ça de la perspective de Nouveau-Brunswick en particulier, mais nos services d'hôpital, par exemple, sont éparpillés dans la province, et de pouvoir accéder aux spécialistes à travers le transport public, c'est important. Deuxième chose, c'est cette transformation doit se faire au niveau culturel autant qu'au niveau pratique, parce que présentement, je pense qu'il y a une culture d'automobile et trouver les moyens pour les gens ruraux de s'identifier avec ce système de transport comme ils le font en Europe ou en Asie déjà, ça serait important et un clé pour le succès de ces transformations de transportation.
Oui. Oui, merci pour ça. Et oui, il faut avoir des autres options, des alternatives si on veut insister que les gens n'utilisent pas leur voiture. Et oui, absolument, c'est pour les économies dans les communautés loin du centre. S'il n'y a pas un accès à une transportation publique, une transportation qui n'est pas trop chère, il y aura encore des gens qui ne l'utilisent pas. Et aussi, ça sera très difficile de continuer l'éducation, comme vous avez dit, accès à des services de santé aussi. Alors oui, tout est lié, tout est connecté. And with respect to rural and remote communities, whenever we speak about rural revitalization and whenever we hear from experts in that field, transportation always tops the list. Just in terms of making it possible for new Canadians to settle there, but still maintain access to services that often can only be provided in larger centers, in order for young people to remain in their communities, even as they hope to continue their education, in order to attract businesses and enterprise to those communities as well, in terms of the provision of connectivity to health services as well. So transportation is one of those things. Coming to this question of the federal government and what it can do, let's even talk in terms of we always talk short term and long term. In terms of the most immediate needs, the things that you would like to see announcements on or action on tomorrow that would make the biggest difference. Terry, what would those things be right now?
Right now, it would be to actually take a plan that's been presented by the bus industry in Canada, which is for a cross-Canada bus coalition, and start working on that, because it really that plan really does speak to this integration, and it speaks to something very, very interesting which has not been proposed before, which is that if you have a community or municipally run local bus service that is bringing passengers to a motor coach service, that they would consider making an interline agreement in the way that motor coaches currently have with each other. So actually what would have been like a $2 or $3 bus fare for the community bus service now becomes 10 or 15% of the entire fare, or a proportionate amount of the entire fare to get from A to B across Canada. So there's really an incentive to collaborate, and it actually helps support those rural services. The other thing I'd like the government to do is to really, rather than putting out money and announcing money, although money is needed, to think in terms of systems. This is a system. This needs to be thought of as a system. There are trunks, rail, there are branches, buses, there are leaves, the community transit, and the entire organism lives or dies together, to be quite honest. And so the government needs to look around the world at best practice that really already exists and start applying it in Canada. Because if you look at some rural roads, you might see a post office truck not running full. You might see a bus that's taking people specifically for medical appointments. It's funded from the health budget. You might see something that is specifically for people who are unemployed, and that's funded from the social services budget. You probably see a bus carrying, a van carrying a few library books to a rural library. You see all these things happening, and there are lots and lots of people traveling, and there are actually lots and lots of government money being spent on logistics down some of these rural corridors. But the fare-paying passenger doesn't actually have a service, and that's actually rather counterproductive. And I think you could do something like, in Switzerland they have Postbus, and that's actually something the Postal Workers Union Canada has been calling for. is to layer bus and mail together to some rural communities, which actually, people say, oh, we can't afford to do this. Well, yes, we can. We just need to be a bit more constructive and apply some systems and network thinking to layer together all the government logistics needs across all three levels of government, break down the silos, and start thinking about moving people and moving services in a much more holistic way. So one of the things that came up when we were discussing transportation here locally in Chatham Kent, which is a municipality of 100,000 people over quite a large geographical area, is that in some cases, rather than taking the person to the grocery store to deal with the food desert, what might be better is to put a box of groceries on the bus and deliver it to the person. That might actually be a better solution for that particular citizen. So we need to start thinking much more broadly in terms of what can happen when you have a multi-purpose vehicle on a rural road. Who and what can it carry? And how can it connect? How can it be dynamically rooted to meet demand? All the technology exists, but it needs a little bit of strategic thinking and network planning.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to be led from the top with a very, very good ear to the grassroots and what people really need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Picking up then on the long term, and I think again, Tim and Carole, this is a great opportunity to really emphasize in the case of Canada how important the transportation element is in terms of our climate objectives, for instance. As we look to the systemic change that Terry is saying that we need, and we think to the medium and long term, first, how important will this element be, and then what will some of the critical pieces be that all levels of government need to be implicated in, but particularly the federal government.
Well, I'd love to jump in. First of all, I think we want to nominate Terry Johnson for Minister of Transport. I love that's exactly the kind of thinking we need to bring, that kind of holistic thinking. And I'd like to step back to kind of underline Terry's point, because of one of the ways the federal government can exercise leadership in a country where the provincial governments are mandated to have, to run transportation systems for the most part, is that we could emulate what happens south of the border, where 18 US states have a deal with the federal National Transportation Board to pool their resources. So in each of those 18 states, the federal government transport officials sit down regularly with state transport officials and say, how can we pool our resources and use them most efficiently to improve public transportation in that state? And that's exactly what we need to do. And if we had that, and so that's where the federal government can step in and make that offer to collaborate, cooperate with provincial governments. I would imagine most they'll get willing take up from most provinces on such an offer, and that opens the door, because we're in a new world. It's not the old world of transportation anymore. And I think Terry just gave us some elegant examples of really how we can, really reuse our resources, not just what's considered traditional transport resources, but many other creative uses that can really serve Canadians in far more effective ways, and really reduce the cost of living for Canadians if they don't have to have a second, let alone even a first car.
That point that you both made about the comparative examples, I think is particularly important in the case of transportation, where there are so many innovative and effective models that have proven themselves over a great deal of time. I had the fortune to live in a number of different countries and see it in action. In Barcelona, I'm sure for transportation aficionados like yourselves, that they have a system that really rivals anything in the world, and for low-income families is cost-free. For large families is cost-free and can just take you anywhere. Is it correct, this is maybe a piece of trivia, but if you indulge me, is it correct that There isn't a country of our size, with cities of our size, that leaves the municipal level of government entirely responsible for funding its own public transportation system. I had heard that. I mean, I'm not aware of one. Any OECD country. We'll check on that for the next.
I can't give you a definitive answer on that off the top of my head, but that is one of the things that we have.
I think that's the case. But when we invite you back, Terry, we'll have the definitive answer to that. But it is. Let's say, I think we can all agree, at the very least, extraordinarily unusual or highly anomalous for such an important level of transportation to be completely dependent upon the revenue that it generates for its own operation. So,
and if I could jump in, Annamie, and to rely on municipalities who only get 10 cents of all the tax dollars collected within their boundaries to fund that transit, is clear a statement of the dysfunction of our national transportation systems and their inability to meet the needs of Canadians. So that's part of the solution, of course, is giving cities stable, long-term funding, an ability to make decisions that aren't going to be overturned by provincial governments. And that is what they need to be able to do the long-term planning and have the ability to fund the municipal transit systems that we all need.
If I could throw one last question, and then I'll give you all a chance just to make your concluding remark. In terms of our greenhouse gas emissions reductions, what is the potential within this particular sector? If we're able to unlock all of the different things that you've recommended, what is the potential for it to contribute? Is there any hard data in terms of, we know how much transportation contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. What is the potential for reductions in the short and medium term? Let's say by 2030.
If I could speak to that,
please.
I'm really glad you said 2030, because actually changing land use patterns, travel and working patterns, although we've seen some rapid shifts in the last year because of the crisis of the pandemic, those patterns usually unfold over decades, and we have a lot of work to do to actually reverse some fairly negative and inefficient land use patterns in Canada. So what we actually managed to achieve by 2030 is going to actually pretty much determine whether we succeed in getting to a net zero economy by 2050, and we can't fail. We cannot afford to fail. And so what we need to do to slash emissions by 2030 is really focus on mode shift, and not just for passengers, but also for freight, because the whole logistics economy, transportation, is about 30% of Canada's emissions, and a lot of that comes from freight and trucking as well. So anything we do certainly on the passenger rail side also needs to be thinking in terms of how we produce win-wins that help passengers and freight, that move more of Canadian products to market. And we're going to be really critical in the next 30 years in our food exports. There's going to be a lot of crises around the world that are going to need our food exports to flow really quite smoothly. And so the good news on this is that after decades of cuts and underutilization, we actually have quite a lot of infrastructure that we could triage, that we could improve upon, that we could rapidly bring back into use or back to a good state of repair, to get Canadians used to the idea of having a great great transportation system, again, a great logistics system for industry and business and farmers too. But the government has to be willing to act tactically and to use the technology and infrastructure that are to hand now. It really is no good spending 10 years studying something that might get done by 2040. The timeline just doesn't allow that anymore. We can't be thinking in the long-term plans are great, but this is a crisis, and we need to be smart, and we need to use those resources that are right in our hands.
That's right.
And we can get we can reduce emissions by about 50% through mode shift, and then work on electrification to get rid of the last little bit.
Okay. That's very exciting, and it's important for people to know that there are indeed things that can be done, but as you say, they need to be done quickly. They can be done relatively quickly, and we only have the time that we have to do it if we're going to be meeting the goals that not only we have set for ourselves, but our international partners. Carole, I'm going to give you, we've run out of time. We always have more to say than we have time for, but it's the first but not the last. Certainly the transportation element, as I said, is incredibly important, and we need to be focused on as many solutions as we can, and providing a platform for those ideas to be shared. So Carole, Tim, Terry, if anyone has any concluding thoughts, this would be the time to briefly share them. Don't feel obligated, but please do if you have. I'll just throw it out to you, Tim and Carole, first, if you have anything you'd like to say.
I'll just quickly say that the mode shift that Terry mentioned, I think, sounds exciting. And if I had my wish list of what I want to see the government doing right now, is actually living it. They can show by example that the future is bright and that it is doable, and start taking the bus to go to work. All of us can. And that, I think, is critical, actually, in demonstrating that the culture of our future is desirable and doable.
Absolutely.
And I would add too, I'm involved with a big project in Toronto here, working on electric vehicles, and 70% of Canadians in survey after survey say they want their next vehicle, whether it's a car or a bike, to be electric. And part of the problem, and some of the provinces have already shown the lead here, the federal government has a $5,000 rebate for the purchase of an electric car, but they have no rebates for used electric cars and no rebates for probably the most exciting big city transport option, which are electric bikes. And if they added, as several provinces have already and smartly done, subsidies for those levels of transportation, we can see a pretty fast shift in cities like Toronto that are really going to help us meet our climate objectives.
Yeah.
Just to wrap up, I would say that what we really need to focus on is that the social equity and environmental crises, these two crises facing our society, are actually inseparable, and the sustainable transportation is really necessary to overcoming both challenges. And what we need to also bear in mind is that the decarbonization of ground transportation in a way that's inclusive is actually really quite easy. And it's a lot easier to tackle this. It's going to be a lot easier to tackle this than it's going to be tackle some of the other sectors of the economy. So the sooner we do it, the more breathing room we create to meet our climate goals. But we do need to be a little bit careful. Electric cars are not I think there are some levels of government think electric cars are the magic solution, but they're not. A car is still a car, and they're still part of a vicious cycle of poor land use planning, carbon-intensive infrastructure, a pattern of excluding kids, cyclists, and other users from our public realm, and excluding those who can't drive from access to essential services and opportunities. So we have to embrace electric vehicles as part of the solution, but be very cautious of people who think they're panacea.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I love that.